Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. All right. Okay, so I'm Kesper North. I'm the CEO of Gentlemen's Agreement, a nullsec alliance living in Branch. And the title of my talk is Storytellers in an Internet Spreadsheet Game, or the Role of Narrative in Alliance Leadership. To begin, a little bit of background about myself. I've been playing EVE since 2008. I got started running a nullsec alliance in 2009. And have, it's sort of my great passion in EVE, and so I care a lot about it. In real life, I'm a product manager for a large software corporation, and I find that the job skills from alliance leadership and product management overlap very heavily, because as a product manager, you're always telling, you're talking to customers and telling them the story of where you want your product to take them, and where, manager, you're always telling, you're talking to customers and telling them the story of where you want your product to take them, and where, it has the potential to allow their business to grow. So when I say narrative, what am I talking about? Narrative in an alliance leadership context is the story of your alliance that you tell your membership to put context around the events that are taking place and the things that you're trying to get your alliance members to do. In stretching back into the past, it's the history that you would tell about your alliance if you were writing it, the grand saga of, your humble origins as a low-sec mining corporation, and, the time that you finally defeated those mean pirates and, grew to this vast nullsec empire, or took off into wormhole space, or whatever else. So it's a constantly changing and evolving thing. The narrative of your alliance is alive because new things are always happening. It's the ongoing, evolution of your alliance, and you have to, tell your members, about that to give it meaning, to give everything that they do in meaning. With records in fleet participation and so on. So what you're probably wondering right now is, why should we care? And this sounds really abstract. Well, it's actually not, and I'll tell you why. And yes, I did major in English. It's actually a very real thing. The degree to which your membership is invested in the story that you're telling them about what you're doing in EVE is hugely important to critical issues like participation and willingness to go to highly important operations at really bad times. It's crucial to motivating the people in your alliance. I can't emphasize enough how people will just stop showing up if they're not invested in what's going on. Way back when EVE began, CCP made a very intelligent decision in stepping back and giving us this sandbox in which to create our own content. The problem with that, though, is that unless you give people a reason to feel invested, to feel like this is their story, people will not come to structure shooting ops. They won't come to CTAs in the middle of the night. At a higher level, it's the job of everyone in leadership, from corp directors to coalition leaders, to build stories for their alliance that are engaging and exciting. So, moving to a more practical standpoint, let's look at how EVE players see core gameplay. This is EVE. Whether you're missioning or mining or PvP, this is your experience at the most basic level. You have got a little flashy icon, and you're waiting for the gray bars to turn red. And that's fine and dandy. If you're a scout or you're an FC, there's a lot going on that is really engaging. There's all these tactics that you have to think about. But if you're a grunt in a large fleet, really the core gameplay is taking a fleet warp, locking the primary, hitting F1, taking the next fleet warp, repeat until you whelp. And that's it. And that's fine if you're winning on a consistent basis, because as long as you're winning, people get a certain amount of, brain reward for, just the feeling of victory and watching the other guy's space pixels disappear. But what if you lose? Worse yet, what if you start losing a lot? Then this starts to look a lot like this. And that's not fun. That's when people stop showing up to ops. That's when people stop, putting up POSs. That's when people stop, replacing their losses. And that's when failure cascades in alliances really begin. It's not, at the time of, losing some great battle. It's when people stop believing in the story that you're telling them. What you have to do is, instead of making people feel like they're doing this, make them feel like this. Now, when I say telling a story, I'm not talking about writing erotic fiction for your character and signing all your mails Lord, Dragon, Vampire, Elite, Space Master, or whatever. I'm talking about giving people context for the events that are going on in Eve and your alliance's place within it. It's sort of, instead of saying, hey, we're going to fight these guys over there because whatever, you say, we have, been living next to this other alliance for years, and they are always coming and interfering with our operations, and talking about all the reasons that you have to, dislike this alliance that you're attacking, or reasons that you want to defend a friendly alliance. And then you talk about, how important it is for your alliance's goals, for your security, and any of a range of other things. So what else does narrative do for you? Stories build cultural identity. Through a shared narrative and a shared history, people are brought together to a common purpose. There are examples of this throughout history, from religion to nationalism to fandom of a certain internet spaceship game. Sharing the story of an alliance or a corporation or a coalition brings people together and gets them working towards a common purpose. If some random guy asked you to put a Death Star in the ass end of space for him on 2 hours of notice with all the trimmings, you'd probably tell him to get stuffed. But if someone says, well, unless you thought that you could get a juicy kill out of it anyway, but if somebody says, hey, we desperately need this tower up right now, or else the entire invasion that we've been working toward will be delayed by a full day, we'll miss all the crucial weekend timers, and we won't be able to make any progress whatsoever in this war, well, you might be a little bit more interested. Stories also build pride and camaraderie. And that's not something a wise leader will overlook. When your members identify themselves with your alliance, whether they say, I'm a gent, or I'm a goon, or I'm whatever people in NC call themselves, that means that they have a measure of personal loyalty to the alliance and the idea of it. And they're far less likely to abandon it when the going gets rough. Even better, it means that they are invested in promoting the ideals and standards of that alliance. One of my proudest moments as an alliance leader, I was sitting in Jabber one day, just pretending to be idle in our alliance chat, and I saw a new member start blustering. I forget exactly what it was, but it was something like ranting that he didn't need to be told how to fly a dictator all over again. And what surprised me was that a couple of members of the alliance who'd been around for a while started talking to him and saying, no, we have a reason for why we do these things and why we, fly dictators in a specific way. And to me, and it was totally unprompted. And they started talking about how he would have a better experience in Eve if he did this. They'd taken to heart the sort of lessons and cultural changes that we've been trying to impart after all this time. And they bought the culture that Lake, the co-founder of GENTS, and I had been building into it from day one about trying to do things properly and not just pushing button and praying that whatever came through the gate gets stuck in your bubble. This meme that we had created and nurtured, our cultural narrative, had become self-reinforcing. Our members were proud of it, and they were making sure that the new blood caught the meme as well. And that was really exciting, seeing it propagate that way. And the ongoing narrative provides not only a sense of history, but also of having a future. And then, of course, there's the fact that if your alliance has a sense of developing towards something, that is, if it's moving towards something, then people are more inclined to work towards those goals, and they're less inclined to abandon them because they've invested effort and energy. But you have to communicate that to people. People need to understand where you want your alliance to go before they can help you work towards it. And that's one thing that I've seen a lot of nullsec alliances not pay a lot of attention to. And the next one is a really important point, I think, that is often ignored. If you don't build your own narrative, people who do understand narrative and wield it like a weapon will make one for you, and you're going to hate it. This is what, in many respects, Goonswarm has done very successfully over and over again. The reason why they've had so many pushover regions is that they found the crucial weak points in enemy alliance culture and exploited them quite ruthlessly. This effort has been in a large part because of an organization within Goonswarm that was built by a guy named Vile Rat, who unfortunately recently passed away. But that organization, Corps Diplomatique, I've worked with many members of that organization within Goonswarm, and they have a supreme grasp of narrative and how it drives and shapes alliances. So those guys are the sorts of people who will manufacture a narrative that can be very dangerous for your alliance if you don't have one to give to your members already. So in doing so, in hijacking the narrative of an enemy alliance and using channels like news sites and forums and Twitter and so forth, you can actually subvert a hostile alliance's narrative, or if they've never had one in the first place, you can give them one. And it can either replace their own or occupy the space where a narrative should be. And that can be one of the most destructive forces culturally within an alliance. Now, on that subject, I also want to talk about an area of blindness that alliance leaders often have. Quite often, the first step towards failure cascade comes towards blindness to the fact that your membership does not have access to the same sources of intelligence and information that you do as a leader or even as a corp CEO or director. We're so plugged into the sort of the machinations of interstellar diplomacy that it seems obvious that, of course, we know things like, of course, the CFC is going to stop at Catch and aren't going to invade it, during our invasion of the South earlier in the year. Or, of course, it's not a big deal that we're resetting test because, it's not a big thing. We forget that we need to share information with the rest of our alliance because people aren't psychic, and worse yet, half of them are reading Eve news sites on the internet. You, as line members, need to remind us on a regular basis that it is our duty to keep you informed, because otherwise you're all missing out on half of your alliance's narrative. And you're going to be blindsided when you wake up in the morning and Pandemic Legion is in Titan Bridge range of your home system. And then there's the fact that your alliance's narrative doesn't just build shared cultural identity. It insulates you from enemy agitprop, and that's sort of what I was just talking about. Enemy propaganda is far less effective if your own alliance's narrative already has sort of a built-in defense against it. I'll give you an example, again, from Goonswarm. People often say about Goons, they're terrible at Eve. Well, the fact is that Goonswarm's own internal narrative embraces that fact. They were, from early in their history, proud of the fact that they were terrible, but they were so persistent and inventive that they could, move beyond that failing. Repeatedly being told that that they're terrible at Eve had no effect on their morale. And then there's this point. Narrative begets narrative. Sometimes you have to go to war just because it fits the story. You might say that developing a narrative for an alliance or a corporation and maintaining it for a long period of time is a lot of work. Well, it turns out that once you start weaving a narrative, it's self-propagating. You begin to see what the next steps should be after you've taken this area of space, or you've built this Titan or whatever. You can see where you want to go. And sometimes that leads you into new and exciting places where you never expected to be. And sometimes that really ends up with you screwed. But that's just how Eve is. Okay, so I've talked a lot about how important narrative is. How do you create it? First, set goals. You can't tell a story if you don't know the plot. You have to have a specific, reachable, and concrete set of goals, things that you want your alliance to do. And that can include taking space, it can include, certain industrial projects, it could include, taking revenge on some enemy that you fought in the past, but you have to have something that you're working towards. Otherwise, people feel like your alliance isn't going anywhere. And what's more, you have to communicate those goals clearly and effectively, or else people will just be operating in the dark and wondering why they're going on ops in the middle of the night that are appearing to achieve nothing. So, yeah, like I just said, tell your alliance how you're going to achieve these goals and how you've achieved similar ones in the past. That actually, the last part is very important because you have to maintain credibility. These goals have to be things that you honestly can prove to your alliance that you have the potential to achieve. And finally, you have to go out and do it. As CCP said in the intro video of the game, dare to be bold. You have to, take advantage of opportunities, even if you think maybe you're being a little too big for your britches. In the early days, actually it was a little bit before I started running Magesta Empire, back when dysprosium moons were worth a mint. There was a standings change between the Northern Coalition and an alliance called Circle of Two. And all of a sudden, Circle of Two's dysprosium moon in Venal was up for grabs. Well, there was this huge opportunity here because this was a dysprosium moon that was worth more than tech is now. We could make so much money from that. Well, either we could, sit around and wait for Morsus Mihi to take it, or we could spring into action and go and reinforce and take that moon ourselves. And we did that. Morsus Mihi was kind of pissed off. They wanted it for themselves, but they were too slow. And in the end, they had to admit that, you guys, were motivated, and you got to it first, and we'll let you hold on to it. And, there's things wrong with that approach that I could discuss ad infinitum about the mechanics of how the Northern Coalition worked, but that's not relevant to this presentation. And finally, or not finally, but never stop posting. Always keep reinforcing your narrative, keep telling people what it is. It's okay for your narrative to change. That doesn't mean you're a weak leader. That doesn't mean that you're being, indecisive. You have to be responsive to changing circumstances. And that means that sometimes you have to make bold decisions and rethink your vision if it's no longer compatible with reality. But you have to tell people about it. Set expectations. Otherwise, you lose credibility. So how do you do it? How do you, how do I do it specifically? Well, GENTS is known for being super wordy. Really, really, really wordy. In fact, about this wordy. We post a lot. Or at least our leadership posts a lot, and with big, long, ornate posts about, what our plans are, where we're going, what we're trying to achieve, what we'd like to have our members do, and we pack a tremendous amount of information into these posts. That's just one way. There's many ways that you can achieve this. Branding is one of those ways. By having sort of a consistent look and feel for your alliance, you can highlight certain cultural attributes. For instance, the GENTS logo on the top left suggests strongly that I might unironically use the word foofara in a serious sentence. I've included here examples of other alliances that I think have done the branding thing well. You've got Test and Goons, Convicted, Nulli Secunda, Stainless with their anti-Sancha logo, Razor Alliance, Gypsy Band, NCDOT, and CVA. It seems like sort of a minor thing, but having a good logo and just having that sort of and being well branded, having a sort of almost a gimmick that ties your alliance's culture together can actually be really helpful in maintaining that shared cultural identity that is part of what drives narrative and gives people a feeling of being in the same story. So branding is important, but so is propaganda. Both propaganda that is internal and external. Internal propaganda helps reinforce the key messages of your alliance's narrative. For example, this fine gentleman of the Asian persuasion is emphasizing the importance of being able to fly cheap, disposable, yet effective tackler frigates because they always have a place in virtually any fleet composition. By doing so, he encourages alliance members to stop showing up in faction-fit Shimus to a Drake fleet. And of course, there's external propaganda. Done properly, and preferably with a greater degree of subtlety than what is displayed here, it can infect your enemy's own narrative and destroy their morale, as I talked about earlier. Or it might make the enemy enemy leadership grit their teeth and feel the hot blush of shame as they lose another super capital, as was the intended purpose of this little broadsheet. If nothing else, it's good for a laugh. A lot of the stuff, if done well, is really funny and entertaining. So let's talk about a few examples in the past of people who have done this well. Obviously, the canonical example in nullsec is the Great War between Bob and Goonswarm and their associated allies. It's probably the biggest war that nullsec has ever seen, that the game has ever seen. It raged on for literally years, and you've heard mention of it several times already today. But what's really at the heart of this is the fact that even today in Goonswarm, if you talk about the members of Bob leadership who were involved in the Great War back at the beginning, when they made Goons hate them so much, that's still the easiest way to rile people up and get them in fleet. That narrative still has power, even though Bob is defeated multiple times over. It's amazing what this can do, and yet if you can hint at there being a few members of Bob leadership in an enemy alliance, it instantly drives up participation. It's really amazing to see. Then, of course, there's the Burn Jita campaign. Now, Burn Jita came out of a couple of things. One was, of course, the player protests against Incarna and the display of disapproval against CCP, but also about the apparent invincibility of people in HiSec, so the CFC put out a call to try and shut down Jita and burn everything to the ground and show people in HiSec that they were not safe. And then this narrative grew when Mitani made a few missteps at the last FanFest and was removed from the CSM. It was, people also came to think of it as sort of, vengeance for mittens. And that was another powerful driving force. And then, of course, there's Hulkageddon. Not only did it come with great, propaganda posters and so forth, but it also, there was a lot of work that went into, encouraging people to participate in the campaign by making all of these, vulnerable HiSec miners fear for their existence. It also brought together disparate entities from across the Eve, like nullsecers working with lowsec pirates for the first time ever. Interesting stuff. Tying that together with the fact that it was a series of events, that it was an ongoing event, with a set of goals that you could also accrue, sort of ISK or points for, because Goonswarm was paying out for it at the time. And then, of course, CCP uses this a great deal in their advertising, very intelligently too, because really the fact that EVE gives us the power to create our own narrative and play in our own sandbox is the defining feature of the game. It's not like, Star Wars or World of Warcraft, in which you've got, thousands of lines of script and, hours of recorded dialogue and whatever. We're building it ourselves. And so CCP translates that and tells us about that potential with slogans like "I was there" and "EVE is real." That's narrative too. Speaking of CCP, there's a couple of other properties, well, really all the properties that CCP works with, that are very heavily narrative driven. One of which is the World of Darkness role-playing game system, which was the property of White Wolf that CCP acquired some years ago. The World of Darkness role-playing game system uses what's called the storyteller system. That's the name of the mechanical system that decides combat and different, social roles and that sort of thing. It is a system that is designed not to be accurate or particularly structurally complex, but rather to be cinematic and drive and encourage narrative. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's really a good choice for CCP to pick up this property, because it's a similar universe in which, the burden of providing narrative rests on the players rather than on the producer of the game. I'll be interested to see what happens. They had encouraging things to say about it at the last FanFest, and I really want to see what comes out of it. So CCP, please actually make this. It will be interesting. And then Dust. You're still fighting over planets in the EVE universe. Could the next great war be fought between rival console kitty clans who are, absolutely in a froth about something somebody said on the PS3 voice chat or whatever? I don't play console games very much, but presumably they have something like the Xbox Live chat. What if the next great war is fought between mercenaries on the ground instead of in space? That could be really interesting too. So here we are. The universe is yours to do with as you please. You have all these tools, social channels like Twitter, blogs, forum posts, whatever in-game or out-of-game alliance chat you use to build your culture, to create a narrative that will inspire your members, to get them excited about what's going on in the game, and really achieve way more than you ever imagined your alliance possibly could, as certainly GENTS has surprised me over and over again. So you have a unique opportunity. Try not to screw it up. Thank you. A cat is fine too. Any questions?
So, all right. So I have like a question sort of about stories and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if I could ask that. So along the lines of storylines and telling a story, how important is it to get that, that impact? I mean, is that something that you have to get?
Well, I would say that there have been many alliances that have been successful without it, but I would also say that the political landscape in EVE has grown considerably more sophisticated over the years, to the point where it's getting to the point where you have to be able to work on that level and have to include a measure of, understanding of stories and narrative in order to compete with the people who do.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting you brought that up, because one of the stories that I recently found out is that we actually did have another prize winner who didn't collect the prize.
Oops.
I just got a tweet about it. Is there someone named New Trinity? First name is Kim. I know there's two New Trinities here. Come up.
So to sort of go along with the story, I actually have the prize, and it's for Kim.
Ladies and gentlemen, She said yes. There was a risk.
Well done, well done.
Wow, I don't know how you can follow that. I don't have the same question for him, but
I'll tell your wife, Shanko, if you do.
So I actually work with Kesper in gentleman's agreement, and I do have a question that is not planted. He did not know I was going to ask this. You've talked about telling a story to line, kind of to the line and to the general membership. Would you say that same story translates throughout up into the other alliance leaders, and what is the difference, and what do you have to do differently to keep alliance directors, corp CEOs, and others that have a different view of the story and keep them kind of engaged?
You know, I would swear that question was planted because that was actually one of the things that I meant to cover and forgot. So well done. I would say that narrative, when it comes to dealing with various levels of your alliance, and also if you're in a coalition with people who are outside of your alliance, it's sort of like a Matryoshka doll. You have different layers of narrative based on sort of the compartmentalized information that each group has access to, because you do have to be aware of OPSEC. You do have to be concerned about the perceptions that your allies and your enemies have of you. And so, if, for instance, you really, really want to, get in on that fancy new space that your coalition is taking, but you don't want to step on any toes, you have to, encourage your members to, push really hard, to shoot for that. But on the other hand, you don't want to go to, one of your allies and say, hey man, we're taking that space. What you going to do about it? Because that's just sort of a dick thing to do. That sort of thing applies all over the place. So it's very important to have layers of narrative to each, sort of level that you're working with. So that's a very good point.
You've commented on the importance of narrative for building an alliance. How important is truth in the narrative? Is it helpful, or is it largely a hindrance to produce a compelling story?
So I think that in every narrative there has to be a kernel of truth, or else it will simply ring false. Sometimes that truth can be wildly distorted by hyperbole for dramatic effect. Sometimes you have to cleave fairly close to what actually happened, and it's very situational. You have to sort of develop a sense almost for how to do that without, risking your own credibility or, generating a really overblown narrative.
So actually kind of follow up to both of those guys.
Yeah.
So the first part, what if you find that your narrative is actually the narrative of someone else's? How do you distinguish yours from theirs?
Well, I mean, in a way, every narrative in EVE is always part of someone else's narrative, because the whole point of this game is the interaction between players. And of course, every narrative is going to affect every other narrative. So it's entirely possible that, it could range from something as simple as, there's a conflict of vision between, what NC.dot wants to do and the CFC wants to do, or there's something like, when Bob was disbanded by a director who decided to defect. That is a tremendous and powerful intersection of narratives and stories, and that is part of the magic, I would say, of EVE.
Cool. All right. So the second part is, what would you say if, the concept of storytelling and narrative is just fancy words for brainwashing? Isn't that really what you're trying to wrap around, as opposed to narrative for everyone else? Because you're really just trying to control your own people.
I would not say control, I would say trying to motivate, which is, I would say very different things. Brainwashing implies that you will not admit the existence of other truth, and that there is one true truth. That's not something, I may have been guilty of that at times, but that's never something that I've set out to achieve. And I think that's true for most alliances. It's always a fine and difficult line, because, you might be really convinced of, sort of the story that you're trying to tell, and that might be, completely unrealistic and divorced from reality. But one thing that I've always tried to do in GENTS is, be honest as far as, my perceptions of what other alliances are trying to achieve, what we're trying to achieve. And, sometimes I succeed, sometimes I fail, sometimes I get surprised. So, yeah.
I thought it was interesting what you talked about, how if you don't have an alliance narrative, or even if you do and it's not well communicated, it leaves the room for others to force a narrative upon you. Mm-hmm. And that reminded me of a time several years ago. I was in 00 with Knights of the Southern Cross. Mm-hmm. And now perhaps this was just my level of involvement at the time, but I didn't feel that we had a very strong narrative in any way, shape, or form until we were being kicked out of Wicked Creek, and we were no longer Knights of the Southern Cross. We were kill on sight.
Nice. Excellent.
All right, so the good news is the reception is literally on the other side of this wall.